Thank you very much. I was interested in the comment that I had not sold out. I had written another book about science history, as though I could do anything else. I really have no talent for fiction. I said that to an editor once who asked me if I was thinking about writing a novel. And so when I fessed up that I had no talent for fiction, she said, well, that never stopped anyone else. But this is really more interesting than anything I could have made up. And I've had the most wonderful time working on this book. In fact, I'm sorry that it's finished in some ways. I tell people I have 2 children, but this was my first postpartum depression. But going around talking about it has buoyed my spirits a lot. And I do want to say that it is the direct outgrowth of Longitude. It's a great, big, heavy book, doesn't look anything like Longitude, and yet the one did come from the other because Galileo tried to solve the longitude problem. And it was while reading about that I came on the idea for the new book. So I would like to show you some slides tonight, part history, part science, part how I spent my summer vacations for the past few years. And I think I can do the slides myself from here. Let's see if this works. No, it doesn't work. Ah, there he is. Okay. My hero. I confess to being infatuated with Galileo. There is a vast underground network of Galileo groupies. A lot of them are here tonight. I know. He is a charismatic character. There have always been people interested in him, and I'm certainly one of them. And, of course, as a writer, I wanted to write something about him. I just didn't think there was anything left to be said. He is a mythic figure. He gets credit for lots of things he didn't do. And although he did so many things, it's hard to think we'd have to make up myths about him. But this book was the opposite problem from Longitude, because whereas almost nobody had heard of John Harrison, who was the hero of Longitude, everybody has heard about Galileo, and just about everybody has something he knows is true about Galileo and knows it with a passionate conviction. And it might or might not be true, but people have really strong feelings about him. This is his daughter, at least we think it's her, and she is the person who convinced me that there was a lot to be said about Galileo that had not been said before, because if you're anything like me, you grew up thinking that Galileo was the great enemy of the Catholic Church, that he was someone who turned his back on religion to pursue a different truth in science. And that's certainly what I thought. I think most of us trace the split between science and religion to the person of Galileo. But his daughter made me realize that that was probably a wrong impression, because she was a nun. And when I first discovered that he had a daughter, I mean, that alone was a shock, because in all the things I'd read about Galileo, and I'm an amateur astronomer, I read all that stuff, I never knew he had a daughter. Did you know he had a daughter? Okay. I mean, he's a person we tend to think of as a marble bust. And then for the daughter to be a nun, I mean, this was truly remarkable. You know, it was one of those moments I felt everything go inside out. And in this first letter of hers that I read, she was talking about the clock in her convent and how she'd been trying to fix it. And I just had an image of this young woman in the early 1600s being Galileo's daughter and fixing this clock. And it was so wonderful. I didn't know where to grab hold of it first. And so as soon as I finished Longitude, I went to see what I could see about her. And my first research led me to 124 letters that she had written to him that he had saved and that still survive in the original, but that had never been published in any other language. So I thought, well, that's it then. I will translate the letters and I'll look at him again through that relationship. And that's basically what the book turned out to be, although it was a long journey. I wanted to go to Italy and try to see all the places they had both lived. And I wanted to go to Italy as it was then, which was, of course, a fantasy, and yet in some ways you can actually do that. This is, of course, the Leaning Tower of Pisa. We start here because Galileo actually started in Pisa. He was born there in 1564, and he grew up looking at this. And I've always thought that had a tremendous effect on him, and that maybe that was how the tower was most important, you know, whether or not he actually dropped the cannonballs off the Tower of Pisa or off some other high place. There was certainly no shortage of bell towers in Italy in the 17th century. This is the house where Galileo was born. It is still there, and I think I have a pointer here, up in one of those second-story windows. There's a little mosaic of him, kind of a stained glass treatment of him. This is the historical marker. You can barely read it, but it identifies this house as being the birthplace of Galileo. And then right here, although it's backwards, we'll see just how good your Italian is backwards. This is the sign in this house that tells you there's an apartment for sale. And I was really struck by that. You know, how could they sell an apartment in Galileo's house? But this is Italy. You know, if they turned every building that had historical significance into a museum, everybody would have to leave the country. Galileo was not only born in Pisa, he went to school there, he never graduated, but he did attend the university, and then he taught for a while at the university. But he was not very much liked, and within a few years, he moved on to Padua, where he became a professor. This is the university as it looks today, although probably doesn't look very much different from the way it did in Galileo's time, or even when it was founded in the 1200s. And the amazing thing about Galileo's time at Padua is he knew he was living the time of his life. It's interesting to reflect as you reach a certain age, you know, what is really the best time in your life, and do you know it when it's happening to you? He taught astronomy, not the sun-centered view, really, the old-fashioned astronomy with the Earth in the middle. This is his actual teaching lectern. It's still there. And they put that little bust of him up in case you have trouble conjuring the effect. These are the steps up to the lectern that he would have walked up 18 years. He taught a lot of astrology, too. He taught medical students how to cast horoscopes, because that was considered an important part of diagnosis and treatment. This is another part of the university. It's anatomical theater, where Galileo undoubtedly watched human dissections because he wrote about them and was able to make metaphors in astronomy about anatomy. And he had actually started his own college career as a pre-med student at Pisa because his father wanted him to be a doctor. But he wasn't interested in that and switched over to mathematics. This is that same room as it looks today. It's a remarkable structure. It's standing room only. There are just ascending tiers of places to stand. and there were no windows. It was torchlight only, and so it was only a wintertime venue. And even in the wintertime, between the people, the corpse, the torches, and the stove burning the parts, I mean, you can imagine the stench could probably knock you flat. I was so excited to be in this place. I went home raving to my children that I had stood in the place where Vesalius had taught. You know, it was demonstrations like these that proved that men and women actually had the same number of ribs, and that the nerves emanated from the brain and not the heart. So I said, there I was, where Vesalius and Falloppio taught, and my son gave me one of those level teenage looks, and he said, they don't call them fallopian tubes anymore. They call them oviducts. The day I was there, I stumbled into the graduate exams and actually wound up in the room where this young woman was defending her thesis in front of a panel of faculty members in robes, and they passed her. And she had her entire family there, grandparents, babies. It was really a wonderful scene. And so then she came out in the courtyard. See, they've given her this peaked cap and a wreath of real laurel leaves. Here's another graduate. He's being face and body painted by his father. And then they put on bathing suits, and they go through the mill where their relatives kick them and spank them and throw water on them. Really quite wonderful. This is Venice, where Galileo was able to travel on the weekends while he lived in Padua to have a good time. And this is where he met the mother of his 3 children. She was a Venetian woman, considerably younger than he was, and not quite of his social station, which may explain why he never married her. But they were together a long time. And when she became pregnant, he moved her to Padua, but not to his house. He had students living with him, foreign noblemen studying with him, instrument makers, because he had a lot of expenses. His teacher's salary didn't really cover his expenses, especially when he started having children. So he had a live-in instrument maker who helped him produce a useful item for sale that could augment his teacher's pay. This is that item. It was called the Geometric and Military Compass. And it is a forerunner of the pocket calculator. And he was very successful with this. Sold the instrument itself and a booklet about how to use it. And Galileo never claimed to invent the telescope. He says very clearly in his first book about astronomy that he heard of this new invention, this Dutch spyglass, which really was a curiosity, a toy. You could look across the square, across the room, things would look bigger. But Galileo was the one who realized that if you could build such a thing with care and with high-quality glass, you would have something extremely practical. And at Venice, he had access to excellent quality glass, and so he developed an instrument which he presented to the Venetian Senate. This is an artist's conception of that moment when Galileo presented the telescope. He didn't actually call it a telescope himself, but he presented this new object to them, and he had a remarkable return on that gift because they gave him tenure and raised his salary by quite some, because he showed them that if you went up to the bell tower and looked out toward the horizon, now the enemy ships were visible about 2 hours ahead of the time the lookouts could see them. So this was an instrument for the military, and he was well rewarded. Then he had the idea to turn the instrument up, where he discovered just about everything. These are Galileo's own drawings of the moon. He was a very talented artist, talented musician. He did many things well. And because he really understood about painting and perspective, he quickly realized that the play of light and shadow on the moon's surface was the result of mountains and valleys, that the moon was not this perfect, smooth, white orb that the Aristotelian philosophers swore it was, that it was a big rocky body like the Earth. And he was bold enough to say that out loud. He also discovered 4 never-before-seen objects that were in constant motion around the planet Jupiter. And these are Galileo's own observations, night to night, sometimes hour by hour, of the changing positions of those new stars, something truly remarkable. And he presented these to the Florentine government. This is what they look like in modern satellite images. Of course, nowadays we call them the Galilean satellites of Jupiter. But Galileo didn't call them that. He called them the Medicean stars, which he put, if you can read backwards, you'll see this is his book where he announced his great discoveries and dedicated this book to the Grand Duke of Tuscany. And thank you. You might, while I'm talking, want to do that to all the rest of them. Thank you. Dedicated it to the Grand Duke, who responded by giving him a court position as the court philosopher and mathematician, which also carried a tenured teaching post at Pisa, but without any teaching duties, which is probably what every professor really aspires to. This is what Galileo looked like at about this time. You'll notice in every image of him that's painted or engraved, you always see him with a square white collar. And now we know who sewed, mended, and bleached those collars. That was one of the things his daughter did for him. Once Galileo was in Florence, he continued making discoveries and writing about them. These are his drawings of the sunspots. This was another outrage because now it was the face of the sun that wasn't smooth and perfect, but was covered with black splotches that moved and changed. And it was another myth about Galileo. I always thought that he went blind because he had spent too much time staring at the sun. But he was smarter than that. He didn't really stare at the sun. He let the image fall through the telescope tube onto a piece of paper where he traced it. So his blindness later in life was a pretty typical course of cataracts and glaucoma, and maybe aggravated by infections, because when you pass a telescope around to a lot of people, that's a good way to get an eye infection. This is Galileo's student and friend, Benjaminetto Castelli, who was his friend for life. He had friends who were churchmen all his life, devoted friends. Just another way of saying that the argument was never a clear-cut case of science versus religion. It was much more complicated than that. And Castelli was the one who actually came up with that clever way of observing the sunspots safely by using the paper and the tracing. But when Galileo started writing about the sunspots, he wrote in Italian. which was another remarkable innovation because scholars were supposed to write in Latin and communicate with other scholars. But he was starting to get interested in communicating to a wider public audience, kind of the Carl Sagan of his day. And he took as much flack for it as Carl Sagan did. This is another church astronomer, Christopher Scheiner, who became Galileo's enemy over the issue of the sunspots because they had different opinions about what they were and different claims for having seen them first. This is Madama Cristina. She was first the Grand Duchess, the wife of the Grand Duke, but when her husband died and her son became the Grand Duke, she was not willing to relinquish her title, so that her son's wife had to have a different title. She had to be the Archduchess. And even when it was her grandson who was the Grand Duke, she was still the Grand Duchess. A person of tremendous power and tremendous religious devotion. And she got very nervous about Galileo and the things he was saying because they seemed to be at odds with the Bible, most notably the book of Joshua. I mean, why would Joshua have to tell the sun to stand still unless it had been moving? So she was worried, and Galileo wrote a very beautiful explanation back to her, trying to set her mind at ease, in which he expressed his own theory on this, which was that the Bible was absolutely the true Word of God. However, it was never meant to teach you astronomy. And sometimes when it seemed to be talking about things in the everyday world, it might be speaking allegorically. So that if the Bible as written was an apparent contradiction of the works of God as understood through science, then probably you had just misinterpreted the Bible. That once you had it all figured out, the deep meaning of the Bible and good science, it would all be one truth. And there really was no conflict. He had this wonderful expression: the Bible is a book about how to go to heaven, not how heaven goes. Unfortunately, at that time in Italy, a layman such as Galileo could not be talking about how to interpret the Bible because he was in the wake of the Protestant Reformation and the Catholic Counter-Reformation. So it was all very well for someone like Martin Luther to say that the average person could read the Bible and have an individual interpretation of it. But for a Catholic to talk about interpreting the Bible in a way different from the way the Holy Fathers of the Church interpreted it, that was a heretical belief. And so Galileo crossed swords a little bit with this gentleman. This is Cardinal Bellarmine, who was later canonized. He's now Saint Robert Bellarmine. And he was part of a group of theologians who actually moved to outlaw the Copernican view of the universe, to say that it could not be taught or argued as a real-life scenario. So once that happened, Galileo stopped talking about it in public, and he turned to safer things. The microscope, for example. Kind of play with the optics of the telescope and you get a microscope. And he did that. He read a lot of poetry. He wrote literary criticism. He worked on the longitude problem. That was safe. Especially the moons of Jupiter seemed to promise a solution to it. He was competing for money in Spain, but he never did collect it. Then, after about 7 years of not saying anything about the sun being in the center, although many of the things he had discovered seemed to really argue that the universe might work out that way. This former friend of his got elected Pope. And he was a very intellectual Pope. And Galileo and he was also from Florence. So there were all sorts of indications that there would be a new age of intellectual freedom. And Galileo got tacit permission to write a book comparing the sun-centered idea of Copernicus with the earth-centered idea that everyone thought was the law. This is just a schematic drawing of the Ptolemaic system with the Earth at the center. And it looks very neat on paper. However, if you really observe the sky and the different rates at which things move and the way the planets sometimes loop-de-loop around, if you want to account for all of those appearances, you have to come up with a much more complicated model. You build something that looks like this, with wheels within wheels, a fantastic gear work that can account for all these different motions. The Copernican system, this is actually a page from Galileo's book, The Dialogue on the Two Chief World Systems. The Copernican system makes a lot of it more rational. It doesn't make it quite this simple, because he was still stuck trying to keep everything in perfect circles, which is tough to do. But it explained a lot of things, you know, why Jupiter could have moons around it going around the sun, and the Earth could have its moon, and you wouldn't have the situation where everything else in the universe was turning around the Earth, but the Earth didn't move at all. That seemed ridiculous to Galileo, although at the time it was a pretty ridiculous thought that the Earth was moving. Even now, you know, when you stop and say to yourself, we're actually spinning at 1,000 miles an hour, it's still hard to swallow, I think. Meanwhile, the daughters, Galileo brought all the children with him when he left Padua. And he put the girls in a convent, into this convent. This is how it looks today. The wall is the original structure, but this is all new. And he very much wanted to keep them near him, and was able to get them both into this place, even though it was against the law in Florence to have natural sisters in the same convent. And the first couple of times I went to Italy, I would ask about the convent, and people used to tell me, oh, it's not there anymore. But then I realized what they meant was that the nuns weren't there. But the building is there, and although most of it has been rebuilt, there are a couple of 14th century frescoes still in there. And it's now run by Carmelite fathers. This is St. Clare. The order to which Galileos Daughters belonged was the Poor Clares. And Clare founded this order of contemplative nuns to pray for the rest of us, pray for the souls of the world, and they live cloistered. Clare actually today is the patron saint of television. It's really a beautiful story because one Christmas she was terribly sick, and she was too sick to walk into the chapel for the Mass. So she prayed that God would somehow allow her to see the Mass. And during the night, she was able to see not the Mass there at San Damiano, but the Mass in Francis's church in another part of Assisi. So in the morning, she was able to tell her vision to the other sisters. This is another room in the convent. This ceiling is original too. It's all this beautiful worked wooden ceiling. And this is the room where the nuns sat in the afternoons and did their needlework. That was another innovation of Claire's, that between the hours of prayer, they would work, do useful work. This is my friend Mother Mary Frances, who was a modern-day abbess of the Poor Clares. She has been the federal abbess of Poor Clares in America, and lives very much the way they have always lived, cloistered. She has been the mother abbess at her convent for about 50 years. Her convent is in Roswell, New Mexico, home of the great UFO event that never happened. Right? I had actually been sent to Roswell by Omni magazine to write about the phenomenon of the crash and the conspiracy, and how this goes on since 1947. And there are 2 museums in Roswell devoted to the incident, but you may not be surprised to learn there's nothing in either museum. They have department store mannequins dressed up in operating room scrubs, performing alien autopsies, and they have dioramas and books about it. But however, if you get to Roswell, there's also the Robert Goddard Museum, because after he became the father of rocket science in Massachusetts, it became dangerous for him to continue his work because he would blow things up and there were a lot of people around. So he moved out to the desert in New Mexico where he could do as he pleased. And so there is a museum devoted to his work that has his workshop in it, and that's really something to see. I did not know when I was in Roswell that the Poor Clares were there. Nor did Mother Mary Frances know that Galileos Daughters had been her spiritual sisters, and she was very pleased to learn that. She has been a phenomenal help to me on this book because having grown up Jewish in the Bronx, the convent life was the hardest part for me. And so I found her on the internet. She doesn't have email, but she has her address posted on the Poor Clares website. So I wrote to her about my project, and she and I have kept up a correspondence for about 18 months now. And she not only was helpful sending me books she had written about their life and answering questions for me, but she also read the manuscript for me. And of course, she prayed for me. I'm very, very grateful to her. And the reason here she is living cloistered in this place, but at one point, she actually received a calling to found a daughter convent in Holland and had to go there to set it up. And on the way to Holland, the plane stopped in Rome, and the Archbishop in charge of her diocese got her an audience with the Pope. And this picture was taken as she was meeting the Pope, which is why she looks so happy. Now, these are the actual letters that Galileo's daughter wrote to him. This is an illegal image, I will admit that. When I went, had to go through all kinds of hoops to get into this library. And you can't go in with a briefcase or a pocketbook, so they give you a cubby hole to put things away. And I was about to put my camera in it too, and the guard said, "Oh, no, you can take the camera." So I thought, well, if I can take the camera, I can use it, right? And this page was real. This was the page this was the first page I felt moved to photograph. This is a letter here. See, when she finished the letter, she would fold them up. You can still see all the fold lines. She would fold them up, and then she would write his name and his address there. But this piece of paper, this letter was written on the occasion of her brother's wedding. Her brother was getting married, and she wanted to make all the pastries for the wedding feast to save her father the expense of doing that. But being a poor nun, she couldn't afford those fancy things. And so she wanted him to send her the fine sugar and the almonds. And this is the shopping list. Well, so I took a picture, and it was the last picture on the roll. So I put the film in my pocket and I reloaded the camera, and then there were a lot of other pages that I was moved to photograph until the guard came over and clapped a hand on my wrist and opened the camera and exposed the film. I was never so embarrassed in my life. However, I had this one in my pocket. There it is, the only surviving image. This is the library itself. It's the National Central Library in Florence. And I had written ahead. I got instructions on exactly how to get permission to view these letters. And I wrote to the proper person, and I got a letter back. It took months, but I got a letter back, and now I was all set to go. And luckily for me, I mentioned this to someone who had experience doing research in Italy, who just laughed and said, no, you're going to need more than that, and I'm going to help you. I'm going to write you a Dazzler letter, which he did on Harvard University stationery, calling me a scholar of distinction at work on a project of great merit, and it was signed with all his degrees earned and honorary, and a dime store seal with a ribbon. When I got to the library, the person who'd written me the letter was on vacation. No one had any idea who I was. And I produced this Dazzler letter, and I got right in. This is a piece of candied citron. This is one of the great things that went back and forth between Galileo and his daughter, because he had a real sweet tooth, and he would grow these fruits, and then she would candy them for him. And you can still buy this in Florence. And it is so sweet that, I mean, I couldn't even eat it. You bite into it, you get an instant toothache. This is what her clock would have looked like. This is a German convent clock from the early 17th century, and hers was German. Her uncle, Galileo's brother, had actually bought it in Germany. And it's about 2 feet high, so it fit in the basket. And it went back and forth a few times between them. And this, of course, was the subject of that first letter I had seen. So it was thrilling to get to see what the clock actually looked like. This is another picture from the convent. I just love the way the roots of this tree have actually split open the stone wall here. It's remarkable with all the things that she did for her father. Sometimes she copied over letters for him, but her letters strongly suggest that she was actually the one who wrote out the manuscript for the dialogue, because this was a book he had worked on in various formats and over a long period of time. So when he was getting ready to actually have it printed, it had to all be coherent and in order and copied in a legible handwriting. And it's just one of the better ironies, I think, that this nun in this cloister was writing the book that later brought Galileo to trial by the Inquisition. This is the title page of the book. It's a beautiful engraving, and it shows Aristotle, Ptolemy, and Copernicus having a discussion about the shape of the cosmos. And that's really what happens in the story. There are 3 characters, and it's a wonderfully written book. It's very entertaining. And these 3 fellows decide they're just going to take 4 days off and spend the whole time talking about the structure of the cosmos, and whether the sun is in the center or the earth is in the center, and all the arguments on both sides. And they do that. This book is also written in Italian for a popular audience. And while Galileo was working to get it finished and going back and forth to Rome, negotiating with the printer and the publisher and the censors, of course. All books had to go through censorship before they were approved for publication. The plague broke out. And this is a plague doctor's costume. You know, there was a remarkable mix of good hygiene and superstition, because a lot of what was done in terms of quarantine made sense, even though nobody had any idea about the true route of transmission of the plague. But there was a sense that it somehow stuck to your clothing, so that if you were a doctor, you didn't want to be walking around in a woolen suit. You wanted something slick and smooth like this, so the plague would just roll off you. And in some way, the plague was carried in the air, in the bad air, so that if you had this big beak mask, you could fill that with flowers and spices, and that would protect you from the foul vapors. And so when the book appeared and began to draw criticism, even though it had gone through the proper channels, Galileo was called to Rome, even though there was plague, and he was an old man and a sick man at the time. This is Rome as it looked in that period. And because he was coming from a plague region, and there was no plague in Rome, he had to be in quarantine for 2 weeks before they would even let him into the city. And it was a horrible shock to him to be called to trial over this after all that he had gone through working on the book. And it was tragic to think that the church of which he considered himself a member was now opposed to him. This is how we usually envision the trial, you know, cast of thousands. But actually, it took place in a small room with just 3 other people. And it was a revelation to me in this age of court TV to learn that the entire transcript of Galileo's trial still exists. And you can actually read question and answer all the way through, which of course I couldn't resist including in the book. And through all of this time, the trial was a very long, drawn-out procedure, because once they brought him to Rome, they just made him wait a long time before the questioning even began. And then the bouts of questioning were separated by days or weeks, so that months went by. And through all of this, he had left his daughter in charge of all his personal affairs, which she somehow managed to do from inside the convent. This is the interior of St. Peter's Basilica in Rome. And this structure at the back here is the baldacchino, which Pope Urban VIII was busy building during his and Galileo's time. He built many monuments and buildings for the beauty of Rome and his own aggrandizement. It looks small in here, but this is over 100 feet high, because anything inside St. Peter's looks small. And I love that about the architecture of those churches, that you actually get a sense of an infinite space. When you're in those churches, there is something that big about them. This altar is actually built over the tomb of St. Peter, and only the Pope may preside at that altar. And the altar was completed immediately after the trial, when Galileo was forced to abjure. But he was put under house arrest, and he spent the first 5 months with this man. This is Ascanio Piccolomini, who was the Archbishop of Siena, who still loved Galileo in spite of everything, and had him at his house, and took it upon himself to try to pluck him up so that he could get back to doing science. This is the cathedral at Siena. Very gorgeous, gorgeous church. And this is the Archbishops Palace, which is immediately adjacent to it. So that's where Galileo spent those first 5 months. He had an apartment in the palace, and he began work there on another book. This is another view of Siena. It really is all brown. Every building is brown. And as was true during the trial, all through his detention at Siena, his daughter continued to be in charge of the household, had the servants report to her on the wine, the oranges, mail that had come, and sometimes secret doings that went on in the house. She knew about everything, and she wrote to him at least once a week these highly detailed letters, because he, on his part, was desperate for news of home, and so she did all of that for him. This is his house in Arcetri. He had moved to this house literally around the corner from the convent because he wanted to be near her. Before that, he had lived about an hour's walk away, but the older he got, the tougher it was to make that walk, and he really wanted to be able to see her. Although she was cloistered, he could visit her and they could talk through the parlor grill. So he had taken this house, but then the call had come to go to Rome. This is the actual house today. It's owned by the Astronomical Observatory at Arcetri, kind of a wonderful turn of events. And it's empty, but they are hoping to turn it into a place where scientists could have meetings, which would be great. This is still part of the house. This is a semi-enclosed area where he could have brought in some of his beloved fruit trees in the wintertime. And from his window, he really could see the convent. It's known which room in the house was his study, and when you look out the window, you see the convent. This is still the same house, but this is an artist's conception of the visit of John Milton to Galileo when he was old and blind. And of course, Milton was young and not yet blind, and wrote about that visit and how he had found Galileo a broken man, a prisoner of the Inquisition. And yet, Galileo really had not stopped working and wrote what scientists consider his greatest book. After the trial, after his daughter died, through his blindness, he had a truly indomitable spirit. And his last book, The Two New Sciences, is the basis of modern physics. It is the book that it's not nearly as much fun to read as the dialogue, because it's like reading a long series of geometry proofs, which is what it is. But it gives a mathematical basis to what was called natural philosophy, what we would call physics. This is Galileo's last student, Vincenzo Viviani, who came to live with him when he was blind. And he was just a boy. He was about 16, but he was brilliant, a real prodigy in mathematics. And so he helped Galileo. He read to him, wrote letters for him, and asked to be buried with him. Now, when Galileo died, Viviani was still a very young man. And because of the trial and the effects of it, although Galileo was never excommunicated, and it's not true that he couldn't be buried in consecrated ground. He was actually buried inside a church, the same church where he is today, but just in a different part of the church. And Viviani was distraught over this and felt that he should have a big fancy tomb, and he worked his whole life to try to get Galileo's body moved to a proper tomb with a big, beautiful monument, which he was designing with the help of sculptors. But by the time he was an old man, he was rich and famous because he became court mathematician, and then he was a foreign member of the French Academy of Sciences. He was known all over Europe, but he couldn't get the body moved. So in a way to pay the tribute he felt he owed Galileo, he built his own beautiful house right on a big city street in Florence, and kind of did this to the authorities by covering the front of the building with a bust of Galileo and these huge scrolls which tell his entire life story and all his achievements right on the front of the house. Okay, same house now. Here's one of the scrolls. This is the sign that says that the whole building is for sale. You have to promise to keep the front the way it is, but inside you can do whatever you like. This is another view of the convent, just to come back to the point that it's the two of them together that make that statement, that for Galileo, there was no need to turn away from religion to do science, that in fact it was an inspiration to him, as religion has been an inspiration to many great scientists. Kepler, certainly, although he was a Protestant, he was a deeply religious man, and he did have that wonderful moment when he finally figured out the orbit of Mars, and he exclaimed how happy God must have been after all those years for someone to come along and really understand what he had put into those creations. So I didn't mean for this to be an issues book, and yet right around the time I was finished with the book, the Kansas Board of Education dropped the teaching of evolution, and I thought, these subjects do go on, don't they? And there still is not really an acceptable way to think about them and enable them to coexist peacefully. This is a stained glass window from the little church of San Matteo, which has also, like the convent, been completely rebuilt in modern times. And the windows are not beautiful like Renaissance or medieval stained glass windows. However, this one is quite lovely in its sentiment. This is the little window over the front door, and this is Galileo, and this is his daughter. So they are together.